Thank you for joining us around the fire. Now, want to hear a scary story?
Once upon a time, in a small village, there lived a poor woodcutter and his wife. They had 2 children, a girl named Gretel and a boy named Hansel. The boy had his father's blue eyes and darker features, while the girl inherited her mother's bright green eyes and blonde hair. Despite the woodcutter's best efforts to provide for his family, they struggled to make ends meet. One day, the woodcutter's wife hatched a sinister plan. She suggested that they take the children deep into the woods and abandon them. "We'd have twice the food," she said, "and twice the drink, and twice the room." The woodcutter was horrified by his wife's suggestion and refused to go through with it. But as time passed, the family's struggles grew more dire, and the woodcutter's wife became more and more insistent on her plan. The family was sickly and thin, and it was only a matter of time before they'd start to perish. One night, when the woodcutter was out chopping wood, the desperate mother took matters into her own hands. She sneaked into the children's room and whispered to them that they were going to take a walk in the woods. They would pick special berries that you could only see by the light of the moon. She promised them a great adventure and an overflowing bounty. After handing each child a small piece of bread, she led them deep into the woods, taunting that they'd find the berries soon. "There they are," she exclaimed, "just ahead. Run straight away and fill your baskets with as many berries as you can." Terribly hungry and filled with excitement, the children took off through the dark trees, eager to find the special berries. But as they looked around, there were none to be found, and they soon realized that their mother hadn't followed. Gretel and Hansel were horribly afraid of the woods at night and had made no attempt to keep track of their path. They called for their mother, but she didn't respond, and eventually they gave up. The children huddled together underneath a tree until the first signs of the sun. In the chilly morning light, they began to find their way home again.
"I hope Mother is all right,"
said Gretel, pushing aside a limb to let her brother pass under.
"She never was dependable with directions."
Hansel turned back with a solemn look on his face.
"I think she's been snatched up by a bear.
"Hansel!"
Gretel snapped.
If not something worse."
Suddenly, a small shelter came into view. It barely stood out from the trees around it and was nearly a mirror image of their own home. Other than one noticeable difference.
"Is that our cottage?"
Hansel asked.
"Don't be silly, Hansel.
Gretel said.
We don't have a chimney."
"Whoever it is, maybe they'll give us something to eat,"
Hansel said as his eyes widened.
"And maybe they'll help us find our way home,"
Gretel added. Giggling, the children took off in a sprint towards the cottage, banging on the door and asking to be let inside. A mysterious old woman opened the heavy wooden door with frizzy gray hair and a long black cloak. She spoke with a raspy voice that was not unkind and invited the children inside to grow warm by the fire. After some time had passed, the woman called the children to sit at the table, where a massive feast had appeared. They saw roasted potatoes, carrots, and asparagus in shades of green and purple. Clouds of steam danced romantically above a glistening turkey and several small hens, each accompanied by a wooden bowl overflowing with fresh leafy green salads with boiled eggs, candied nuts, sweet but tart dried berries, and freshly milked goat cheese, all decadently swirled with velvety balsamic glaze. Proudly at the center was a full pig with an apple in its mouth. Even better, there were pastries, chocolates, fairy cakes, and puddings. The children saw trees made of licorice and gingerbread houses. Truffles and tarts and marzipan horses sat beside a mountain of buttery caramel apples, each dazzling with glistening sprinkles and chocolate chips. Gretel and Hansel filled plate after plate, eating as much as they could until they fell asleep on their plates. In the morning, the children awoke by the fire with no memory of moving to the floor. They were covered in heavy quilts and fought the urge to sleep the day away. Finding them awake, the old woman surprised the children with beautiful clean clothes that were just the right sizes, and another feast for breakfast. As the days went by, Gretel and Hansel grew more and more comfortable in the cottage. They were well fed, and the woman taught them how to weave baskets, plant a garden, and bake delicious desserts. For a time, they almost forgot about their parents back home. One night, Gretel awoke by the fire. She could hear a strange whispering that she didn't understand. It was the woman's raspy voice, coming from her private quarters shut away behind a locked door. Gretel tiptoed across the room, her eyes on the soft glow sneaking from the room underneath the doorway. There was a large keyhole in the door, and Gretel cautiously put her eye to it. Inside the room, the woman stood above an ancient book. She was moving her hands fantastically, chanting what sounded to Gretel like gibberish. Most horrifying, the woman looked much older, meaner, and uglier than she ever had before, and Gretel knew immediately that they were staying in the house of a witch. She returned to her quilt on the floor next to Hansel and stared at the ceiling until morning came. Though the food was still delicious, the massive feasts had started to overwhelm the children, and the witch loved to remark about how plump they were getting. "You poor things were as thin as strings," she said, "but my delicious meals will fatten you right up." The smile on her face faded ominously as she stared intently at Hansel, and she said in a low voice, "I could just eat you." A few days later, as the children gathered wood for the fire, Gretel admitted her fears to her brother for the first time. She told him that the woman must be an ancient witch, and her powers were fading in front of them.
So what if she's a witch?
Hansel cried.
We have a warm place to live now, Gretel, and all the food we could ever want. I'll never go back to stale bread and water.
There are always consequences for reaping the benefits of dark magic.
She reminded him.
Didn't you listen to a single one of Father's stories?
The mention of their father stung him. Hansel was so enamored by the life of excess offered by the witch that he'd almost forgotten what his own parents looked like.
I can barely remember him now,
he said distantly.
Hansel, I think that's because of her. I think she needs to use us to strengthen her powers and hide her true appearance. I think she's preparing for something.
Preparing for what?
He asked, fear on full display in his eyes.
If we don't get away from here,
she said,
I think she's going to eat us.
The children devised their plan as they walked back to the cottage, arms overflowing with sticks and twigs. They'd offer to clean the home meticulously to thank the woman for her graciousness and hopefully buy the chance for Gretel to steal a glance at the woman's book. "What well-mannered children you are," the woman cried when they offered their help. "And today's the perfect day. We're having something special for dinner, and I need to fetch some herbs from the forest."
Oh, please!
Hansel exclaimed, nearly salivating.
What are we having?
The woman smiled at him menacingly. She, too, was nearly salivating. As the woman set off into the forest, Hansel scrubbed the kitchen as instructed, and Gretel pulled the ring of keys hanging on the wall. Trying each one, she finally felt the satisfying jolt of the door unlocking and pushed it open cautiously. The book was right before her on the table. It looked ancient, tattered, and worn with use. As Gretel cautiously flipped the pages, she noticed countless different languages and handwriting from more hands than she could count. She lost track of time staring at the book, trying to understand the recipes and spells before her, and finally, she found it. Though she couldn't decipher the text, the crude drawings were clear enough. They depicted a haggard old woman with a large cauldron. The next image showed the woman holding a baby, and then the baby inside the cauldron. The final image depicted no baby at all, but the woman was now young and beautiful. Tearing the page from the book, Gretel sprinted to the door, but was shocked to find it locked from the outside.
Hansel,
She yelled,
the door is stuck. Let me
but
out.
Hansel didn't reply. Instead, she heard the most horrible, grating, terrible, cackling laughter. The witch had returned.
Hansel, answer me.
Gretel cried, banging on the wood with all her might.
He's busy, my dear,
The witch responded in a sing-song voice.
but supper will be ready soon.
Weeping, Gretel glanced around the room for anything that could help her open the door. Only now did she notice the window high on the wall in the back of the room. Quickly, she pulled various items together to create a makeshift staircase and climbed her way to the window. The shutter loudly squeaked as she opened it outwards, and she froze with fear as she waited to see if she'd been caught. But she heard nothing. With a deep breath, she hoisted herself through the window, landing with a painful thud in the grass below. Wincing, she pulled herself to her feet and turned towards the door. She was face to face with the hideous witch. Gretel awoke tied to a chair at a table. The rough ropes were tight and chafed away at her skin, and her ankles were bound to the wooden legs.
Welcome back,
The witch said as she placed a steaming bowl on the table.
I'm so glad you could join me for dinner.
Gretel's vision was foggy, but she could smell another one of the witch's feasts before her.
Where's my brother?
She spat.
What did you do to him?
The witch laughed.
You know the answer to that, darling. I can see it on your face.
Gretel's vision was returning by the second, and she could make out the shape of the witch excitedly enjoying her meal. There was bread and vegetables, and... Gretel screamed louder than she ever had before. In the center of the table, she saw her younger brother. He held an apple in his mouth. Gretel convulsed, screaming and shaking, desperately trying to break away from the ropes, but it was no use. She wept, falling still in the chair as the witch enjoyed the meal in front of her.
It's so delicious,
The witch said, running her tongue up and down her greasy fingers before returning to the roast and carving away.
I know you must be hungry.
I'll never eat anything from you ever again.
Gretel hissed.
You're a disgusting, evil witch.
On second thought,
The witch said as she returned to her feet.
I think I'll feed you myself.
Gretel shook with fear as the woman walked towards her, her small feet seeming to land on the floor below with monstrously loud crashes. The witch's wrinkly hand landed on the table. She had long, overgrown nails hanging from the ends of her fingers, and she used one to stab a piece of meat.
You must have a taste, darling,
The witch said with a horrifying grin as her finger neared Gretel's mouth. The young girl tried to clench her jaw, but the witch used her other hand to plug her nose, and eventually Gretel opened her mouth to gasp for air. Without hesitation, the witch shoved her finger and the meat into Gretel's throat.
Eat it, you little shit! Eat your disgusting little brother!
Gagging and choking for air, Gretel knew what she had to do. She bit down as hard as she could, and the witch screamed. Gretel bit harder and harder, clenching her jaw as the witch writhed around in agony, desperately attempting to pull her hand away from the girl's teeth. The girl could feel the bone cracking underneath the woman's frail skin. With a horrible cry, the witch slapped Gretel across the face with her free hand, and the force was strong enough to knock her over in the chair. But she didn't lessen the grip of her teeth, and with a slurping crunch, the witch's finger tore completely away from its hand. The witch screamed and screamed in agony as Gretel spat the finger towards the fire. The witch dove for it, desperate to save her limb, as Gretel now realized the force of the fall had loosened the rope around her wrists. As quickly as she could, she freed herself while the witch was distracted near the fire and tore into the woods. She knew the witch would be right behind her, and she had no idea where she was going. She quickly arrived at a clearing and looked around, eager to find a pathway towards help. But almost immediately the witch arrived too, and she was more furious than ever.
"You'll never escape me, you little maggot!"
she cried. Gretel could see that the woman's skin was bulging and stretching as if alive. The effects of the recipe were taking hold, and her body was attempting to rejuvenate itself.
"I gave you everything you ever wanted," she hissed, "and now it's time you do the same for me."
The witch raised her hands in the air and began chanting once again. Mist grew from the forest floor and swirled around them. Just as the woman reached the finale of her incantation, Gretel revealed her secret. She had stolen the witch's book. She quickly did her best to read the ancient text, sounding out the words before her as the witch came to realize what was happening. As the winds grew stronger and whipped through the trees, the witch attempted to make her way closer to the girl. A fire glowing blue and purple and green came to life in the center of the clearing, its sparks joining the tornado of fog swirling around them. Gretel could feel herself growing weaker. The witch's dark magic was sucking the life out of her, but she had nearly completed the spell of her own. Gretel collapsed near the fire, feeling her lungs close in and her consciousness fade, as the witch cackled, and finally, in her loudest voice possible, Gretel completed the incantation. But nothing happened. As the witch began to cackle once again, the swirling sparks and mist began to settle, and the woman stood still, satisfied with herself.
"Stupid girl,"
she hissed, looking down at her next meal.
"That spell requires organic matter. Surely you regret tossing my finger into the fire."
Fading fast, Gretel slowly formed a smirk with her lips, holding up the long, broken nail that had torn from the witch's finger. Before the woman realized what was happening, Gretel flicked the nail into the flames, and the witch immediately screamed with agony. Her wrinkled skin erupted in the colorful blaze, turning from red to black before melting into the grass. Gretel shielded her eyes as she felt her strength return. The witch was quickly overcome by the fire, collapsing to the ground before the girl and taking laboring breaths as she lived her final moments. Her hair had completely burned away, and her face appeared to melt like hot wax. But Gretel was certain of one thing. She recognized the piercing green eyes looking back at her now. Her mother had been the witch all along.
"I will haunt you forever," the woman said breathlessly, "even in death."
Gretel stayed with her as she passed, unable to leave her own mother to die alone, and pushed the entire cursed book into the fire. It erupted with a tremendous boom, and then the book and her mother were gone. The woodcutter had given up hope long ago that he'd ever see his children again, and when he saw Gretel emerge from the nearby trees, he couldn't believe his eyes. He ran towards her, openly weeping, and scooped her up into his arms.
"Father, I'm so sorry,"
Gretel cried, burying her face in his strong chest and choking with sobs.
"It doesn't matter, my child.
He promised, squeezing her tight.
You're back where you belong."
Gretel and her father feasted on everything in the house and drank warm cider and laughed and cried together. She was worried he wouldn't believe what she said about her mother, but her father revealed that he, too, had been under the witch's spell. The next morning, Gretel decided to go for a walk in search of fresh flowers to pick, but as she opened the cottage door, she nearly fainted. Sitting before her was the ancient, tattered book of spells, as if she'd never pushed it into the fire. Gretel's heart beat like a drum. The book was calling to her, taunting her. She bent down to pick it up, and the moment she touched it, the horrifying image of the cackling witch's face appeared before her, eyes glowing, mouth wide, and Gretel fell backward in shock. After making certain that her father remained asleep, Gretel sneaked back to her bed and tucked the book underneath the mattress. It belonged to her now, and she could already feel the darkness creeping in.
There are always consequences for reaping the benefits
of dark magic.
By using the witch's spell, Gretel had opened herself up to its evil, planting an infection that would eventually overtake her completely. She could feel the lives of thousands of witches coming alive inside of her. Gretel would be their vessel now, and it felt good.
Once upon a time, many moons ago, there was a rich man and his wife who had everything that money could buy. However, there was one thing that eluded them: a child. They prayed every day, begging and pleading with the gods to grant them the gift of a son or daughter to complete their perfect life. One winter day, the wife was peeling apples beneath a towering juniper tree in the courtyard. As she worked, she accidentally cut her finger, and drops of blood fell onto the pristine snow below. She stared at the ruby-red drops as they seeped into the white powder, and a strange feeling overcame her. Without knowing why, she made a wish for a child with skin as white as snow and lips as red as blood. Suddenly, just like the drop of blood moments before, a bright red berry plopped into the snow. She picked it up, looking above for more, but finding none. The woman placed the berry in her mouth, letting it burst with sweetness across her tongue. The wind suddenly picked up, howling through the branches of the juniper tree, and the woman felt a chill run down her spine. Then she shrugged it off and went back inside, but she did feel a bit more restless than usual. In the days that followed, the woman quickly became aware that she was with child, but she also knew that there was something wrong. As her belly swelled, she grew sicker and sicker, and after 6 months, she was gravely ill. The doctors were baffled, unable to explain the mysterious illness.
"The baby is going to drain her of life completely,"
one doctor warned. But they did their best to make her comfortable, and all they could to deliver a healthy baby. One day, the woman took her husband's hand into her own and spoke in a voice that almost wasn't there.
"The juniper tree gave us this child,"
she said.
"Promise that you'll bury me beneath her."
The husband, racked with grief, agreed to his wife's request. Weeks later, a beautiful baby boy was born. He had skin as white as snow and lips as red as blood, exactly as the new mother had wished. Cradling the child in her arms, she died of happiness, content knowing that her wish had finally been granted. The man kept his promise and buried his beloved wife beneath the juniper tree. Life continued on, and a year or so later, the man fell in love with another woman. They quickly married, and she became pregnant almost instantly. Their new daughter was just as beautiful as her half-brother, but they'd never be the same in his stepmother's eyes. She hated the boy and saw him as nothing more than a threat to her daughter's inheritance. So the woman did everything she could to make his life miserable, denying him treats while spoiling her daughter and belittling him at every turn. His own father did nothing to stop the torment, for he was too afraid of losing another wife's love and affection. The boy was forced to suffer in silence, living in fear of his cruel stepmother's wrath. One day, the stepmother devised a wicked plan to rid herself of the boy once and for all. She lured him to the barn where she revealed a trunk of apples and offered him one. She'd smeared them all with poisonous wax, enough to kill the boy with only a single bite, and his father would simply think he'd fallen ill. "They're as red as blood," she promised. "Take a look." But as he looked closely and reached for an apple, she was overwhelmed by the opportunity and slammed the lid of the chest onto his neck. The boy was decapitated. The woman began to panic, with no idea how she'd explain this to the boy's father, and upon hearing her own daughter calling out for her, she quickly devised a plan. She set the boy's body in a chair, balancing his head perfectly and wrapping a tie around his neck. Then she placed one of the shiny red apples in his hand just before her daughter burst into the barn. The girl couldn't stand the sight of her brother having something that she didn't, and she pulled the apple from his hand and raised it to her mouth before her mother could stop her. She screamed at her beautiful daughter, but it was too late. The girl had taken a bite, and startled by her mother's sudden outburst, she jolted the boy's body. She screamed, looking at her own mother in horror, and sprinted from the barn. But after only a few steps, she collapsed, already succumbing to the effects of the poison. Her mother caught up to her and held her as she died, begging for forgiveness. The woman was beside herself with fear and guilt, and she knew she had to cover up her crimes before the father returned. She set to work dismembering the boy, cooking him into a blood stew. Unable to do the same to her daughter, she gently wrapped the girl in a tapestry and placed her body on top of the trunk. When her husband returned home, she greeted him with a nice, warm meal. The children had gone to stay with their great-uncle, she promised, and so the man simply complimented the delicious cooking. But the juniper tree had seen everything. Overnight, the man became terribly ill, and by morning, he passed away. The woman knew it was her terrible secret that had killed him too, so she placed his body in a wagon and wheeled him to the juniper tree, where she buried him next to his first wife. Once he was covered completely by soil, the woman turned back to collect her daughter's body from the barn. But she couldn't believe her eyes. Her beautiful daughter was walking towards her. The poison had not been as strong as she intended, and the poor young girl had survived after all. As the mother took off running towards her, a flurry of birds burst forth from the juniper tree, screeching and flapping their wings. The sky darkened, blocked by their feathers, and the entire tree shook from their exodus. One bird swooped down toward the woman, dropping a large stone directly onto her head and killing her instantly, and the young girl screamed. The bird landed on the ground next to the woman's body, and the girl saw the shadowy figure of her stepbrother standing behind it. The bird had snow-white feathers and a blood-red beak, and after wiping her tears, she held out her hand in invitation. The shadow disappeared, and the tiny bird hopped onto her finger, then up to her shoulder, where he sat as she walked back to their home.
I live in a medium-sized apartment in a medium-sized American city. It doesn't matter which one. You saw us in the last national election cycle under a Chiron reading, Heartland Debates Choices. My roommate moved out at the beginning of the COVID pandemic to bubble with her boyfriend. Luckily for me, my job picked up, so I never needed to replace her. When the company went remote, I turned her room into my office. I started jogging again when I realized I hadn't been outside for 10 days. There's a park by the river 10 minutes from my place. It's not big, but it's got decent paved trails. I go down mid-morning when regular people have to be at their desks or on their phones. Look, I know I'm not going to enter any marathons, but I need the exercise and I don't want people watching me. It's bad enough I have to watch my jiggle. Anyway, I listen to podcasts or music or whatever when I jog, though only with one headphone in because I'm not an idiot, thanks. A few weeks ago, I had to go for my run later than usual, in the early evening. I forget why, there was a deadline or something. It was the beginning of autumn, and the leaves were starting to come down. I was bobbing along to Lizzo when I saw an eye blinking at me from a log. I figured it was a skunk or a raccoon, so I gave it a half wave and kept bobbing. I do not mess with urban wildlife. I don't want a rabies shot. After a few days, I had to jog in the evening again, and I ran past the log. This time, 2 eyes and a paw, like a hand, returned my half wave. That got my attention. I've heard of pet raccoons getting set loose in city parks when they got too big. If one was abandoned here, I ought to tell the ASPCA or someone. It might even be something dangerous. A bunch of soccer players got surprised by a bear in another park a couple of years ago, and the city had to get wildlife control to shoot it with tranquilizer darts. I stopped to turn off the murder podcast. My fingers were sweaty, and by the time I got my phone unlocked, the log was empty. So I turned back on the story of the boxcar killer and jogged on. I had the boxcar killer in my left ear and nothing in my right. I'd been into the podcast before, but now I couldn't concentrate. The host sounded like someone talking on their phone in front of you in the supermarket line. I mean, the way they sounded before masking came in, obviously. You know what I mean, droning. I started to notice new sounds with my right ear, the one without a headphone. I'd never paid attention to noises in the park apart from what I need to avoid other joggers. Leaves shushing before they fell down, squirrels chirping, birds yelling at each other. I hadn't heard those sounds before. No matter how long I spent in the park, I always had something on distracting me. That day, I even stopped the boxcar killer to listen. My ear was still stuffed up, but there wasn't any noise coming in it. I was hearing in mono. It was pretty great. I felt like I was actually present in the park for the first time. I started noticing the different browns in the leaves, the way water stained the concrete of the path in some places, but not others, the wet wind off the river. Like I was there with my thoughts and not just my body. Then I got bored and turned the podcast back on. Nothing happened for a few days. I still passed the log, but nothing was ever there. I got into a podcast from 2 years ago about Bigfoot, and once I caught up on that, the algorithm linked me to a British series about cryptids. Really goofy first-hand stories about wailing white ladies and wild hunts and giant panthers. I guess over there a cougar counts as a cryptid. One of the episodes was about fairies. Since I'm not the kind of adult who thinks Tinkerbell looks good on my pajamas, I hadn't thought about fairies since I was a kid. I have to say, this dude in Cornwall or wherever hadn't seen anything you could market clothes with. According to him, fairies were weird little animals, not wish-granting ballerinas. What he said he saw playing in a spring of water on his farm were brown, humanoid creatures the size of a cat. They had scrubby, iridescent wings they used to leap up in the air like grasshoppers. They didn't wear cute green outfits, but they had a downy covering that might have been clothes or might have been fur. "Why do you call them fairies?" asked the podcast host in that calm, intimate, you-can-trust-me voice they use with the genuine crazies. "That's what they be," said the farmer. The host had obviously asked him to bring his best rural cosplay. "My old dad sold them many a time, and he taught me to know 'em. Son," he said, "don't you touch 'em or listen to their racket, and no harm will come." Fairies, as we know, are oral or audio hunters, said the host. They attract prey through subsonic frequencies.
Yep. You just keep the radio on in the tractor and they can't get at you. Radio was broken that day.
Old stories say they have a preference for human victims. And have you seen them since, sir?
One more time. Day I lost this finger, I was coming through the home copse not thinking of fairies or much else. Don't usually go that way at dusk. I was talking to a man on my phone about fixing a mower, and as I rang off, I saw a little bright eye just peeping at me from the crutch of a tree. Thought it was a big squirrel. It made a funny sort of sighing, singing sound like a whimper, and I don't know why. I went to the tree to make sure it was all right. It was one of those little fairy creatures.
And it bit you?
Tore my finger off at the root. Sat there sucking the blood like an ice lolly. I had to have 6 stitches.
And you haven't seen them since?
You'd best believe I haven't. I got my hands sewn up and now I wear the headphones everywhere. Listen to the radio, like my dad said.
And you think the fairy you saw is part of a dying species?
Must be dying. Can't lure us in with the sound the way they used to. Now we all have these damn machines in our ears. Audio armor plating. Stands to reason they're fading out in these parts. I haven't seen one since then.
Thank you. That's our pod for today, cryptidarians. Tune in next time for...
My friend Nige says the machines eat our minds the way the fairies used to eat our flesh, but I reckon Nige spends too much time on that Reddit.
Our in-depth dive into England's canals and the monsters that may... I don't live in Cornwall. I live in, like I said, a mid-sized American city. The park I jog in is a regular city park. Lots of trees I don't know the name of, concrete paths, water fountains with dog bowls chained to the bases. And as I ran past that log, I saw 2 eyes blinking at me. So I stopped and went up to it. The farmer was good at describing things. The creature shivering inside the log was about as big as a smallish cat. It had big eyes and a thin coat of downy brown fur. Honestly, it reminded me of a bat more than anything, except its face was, well, human. And it had pointy ears. That was all I saw before it bounded in the air. What I thought were spider webs were actually iridescent membranes connecting its wrists to its ankles. It jumped up on the log and towards the trees. I waited for a while, but it didn't come down. That night I did some looking around online, and the next evening I was ready for my little lost fairy. I didn't see it, and I couldn't hear anything even when I took out my earbud. I left the raw hamburger patty in the log and jogged on. The hamburger was gone the next day, and so was the new one I'd left the day after that. I started leaving the ground meat a little further outside of the log every day at dusk, and after about a week I hung around waiting to see if I could catch it eating. You have to remember, I didn't have anything to go home for. I mean, my job, yeah, but as long as I showed up on Slack at some point during the day and hit my numbers, nobody really cared about anything else. I'd quit using the earbuds at all by this point when I was inside the park. Just jogged into it and took them out. The weird thing was, I kind of noticed less about what was going on around me than before. I didn't even do my usual circuit of the paths. I ran to the log and sat on a bench near it, hoping to see the little fairy. Some evenings I'd catch a glimpse of it dragging the hamburger inside the log, squeaking to itself. After a while, it'd stop making sounds and I'd go straight home. I know the farmer on the podcast said fairies were dangerous carnivores. So did some people online, but so what? Any feral animal will bite if you provoke it. That English podcast made it sound like any wild creature bigger than a squirrel got treated as a potential murderer over there. I couldn't see how one little fairy could hurt me unless I lay down and let it bite me in the jugular, which I had every intention of not doing. Anyway, that's about the time I got mugged. Okay, I didn't get mugged, but it was close. I was sitting one evening on my bench waiting to see the little fairy. It was darker than usual because daylight saving time had just ended. The park has street lamps, but they're not great. I was watching the meat on the log, thinking of nothing in particular, and a guy sat down next to me. He had an N95 mask on, so I wasn't worried at first. Then I thought he was kind of close, even with a mask, so I moved along the bench. That's when he lunged at me, and I saw a box cutter in his hand. He started to say something, but do you know what? My little fairy jumped right in his face. It beat at his eyes with its weak little wings and screamed. Honestly, I don't know who was more surprised, me or the guy, but he ran away yelling, and my fairy and I looked at each other. It was the closest I'd ever been to it. Its fur, and I was positive by now it was fur, looked brown from a distance, but from a foot away, I saw it was brown and gold and gray, like a tortoiseshell cat. Its eyes were black. "Hi," I said, soothingly, like the host of the Cryptid podcast talking to that farmer. "You're a cute little thing. Do you like the meat I've been leaving?" Now, one thing the internet cannot agree on about fairies is if they can talk. I wasn't disappointed when this one didn't. It put its head on one side and shrilled at me. I chirped back. It edged a little closer to me, then spread its wings and hopped up into the tree the way it had when we first met. The next evening it was waiting for me on the log. It backed away when I flopped the hamburger patty out, but it let me watch it eat, which was a first. It was very dainty in the way it scooped little handfuls of raw beef up and nibbled them. I sat on the bench watching it, listening to its happy humming. Its fur was getting thicker and shinier, and it was putting on weight. I think it must have been starving when I first saw it. According to my cryptid podcast, fairies usually live in groups. This one was all on its own. And it was so gentle. Maybe someone had brought a tame one over from the UK as an exotic pet and it got loose. It certainly acted happy to see me after a few more evenings. It even let me crouch nearer to it while it ate. Poor little creature, part of a dying species. It couldn't hunt all by itself. It couldn't sing loud enough to lure in prey. I bet you see where this is going. I decided to bring it home. I did all the research, got a lot of houseplants and did a Costco run for bulk raw meat, lined a shoebox with milkweed floss since I couldn't get thistledown, and every night it got a little darker a little earlier and I got to sit a little closer to my sweet little fairy. I had it all planned out. Once it would eat from my hand, I'd pop it into the shoebox and take it back to the apartment. It was getting colder and I was worried it would die if it snowed. The first day there was a hard frost, I went out with my box determined to bring it home, even if it wasn't completely tame yet. We could figure that out later. I knew it liked me and it liked the food I brought. The street lights were on along the path again. I hadn't been bothered by anyone since my little fairy scared off the mugger. I never saw anyone in the park these days, not that I was looking. Nearly getting robbed hadn't made as much of an impression on me as I'd have thought it would. My fairy seemed unusually pleased to see me. It fluttered right over to the bench when I sat down and started shrilling away the way it always did, like it was telling me about its day. I talked back, telling it about mine. It was so cute the way it clapped its little hands and smiled, and it really did smile like a person, not a dog or cat. Maybe the trilling was language, I remember thinking. Maybe it's trying to communicate. It was communicating, all right. Just not with me. First thing I thought when I felt the pain in my neck was the man with the box cutter had come back. My fairy wasn't chittering the way it had when it scared him away, though, so I figured it was probably something else. I put my hand on the spot, and when I looked at it, the palm was red. I was bleeding fast from a deep bite in an artery. My fairy got more and more excited. It was laughing as the 5 other fairies swarmed over me and started tearing me up. They had waited a long time to get me away from my earbuds and off my guard. They were hungry. That's the thing about fairies. They aren't a dying species. They've evolved a new way to hunt.